What if I told you that the most feared predator in the wild could also be the most loyal companion? Deep in the frozen wilderness, an old man stumbled upon a dying wolf, its leg crushed in a brutal steel trap. The beast growled, weak and afraid, but instead of running, the man knelt beside it. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. A decision that defied nature. A bond that no one believed possible. But was trust enough to tame the wild? Or was the man risking his life? Stay with me. This story will leave you speechless. What if I told you that the fiercest predator in the wild could also be the most loyal friend? What if, in the darkest of nights, a wounded beast and a lonely old man found each other, not as enemies, but as kindred spirits? This is not just a story of survival. It is a tale of trust, redemption, and an unbreakable bond between man and nature. In the heart of a vast, snow-covered wilderness, where silence ruled and the cold was merciless, an old man named Thomas lived alone in a small wooden cabin. His life had once been filled with the echoes of laughter, the warmth of companionship, but time had taken everything away. Now, his only company was the crackling of the fire and the distant howls of wolves that roamed the forests at night. One bitterly cold evening, as Thomas stepped outside to gather firewood, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It was not the usual eerie call of the wolves. It was different. A low, painful whimper carried through the air, filled with agony and despair. He turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. Following the faint cries, he ventured deeper into the woods, his lantern flickering against the dark. There, under the shadow of an ancient oak tree, lay a massive grey wolf. Its powerful body was weakened, its golden eyes clouded with pain. Blood stained the snow around it, and as Thomas moved closer, he saw the source of its suffering, a steel trap clamped tightly around its leg. The cruel device had cut deep, leaving the animal too weak to fight, yet still too wild to trust. For a moment, the man and the beast locked eyes. A silent battle of fear and uncertainty passed between them. The wolf let out a weak growl, a final warning, but Thomas saw beyond the sharp teeth and fierce gaze. He saw pain. He saw a creature that had fought to survive and was now on the edge of death. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward, whispering in a voice barely audible, "I am not here to hurt you." The wolf flinched but did not move. It had no strength left to fight. Kneeling beside it, Thomas reached out, his hands steady despite the fear gripping his heart. With gentle yet firm movements, he pried open the steel jaws of the trap, freeing the wolf's leg. The beast let out a sharp whimper, its body trembling, but it did not attack. It simply lay there, exhausted. Thomas removed his coat, carefully wrapping the injured leg, knowing that leaving it there meant certain death. Against every instinct, against every warning he had ever heard about wild wolves, he made a choice. He lifted the creature into his arms and carried it back to his cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire met the bitter cold of the night. Thomas placed the wolf on an old rug near the hearth, offering it water and scraps of meat. The wolf eyed him cautiously, but did not resist. It was too weak to flee, too tired to fight. Over the next few days, he tended to its wound, changing the bandages, speaking softly to it as if it could understand. At first, the wolf remained distant, its golden eyes watching him with suspicion. But as the days turned into weeks, something changed. It no longer flinched at his touch. It no longer bared its teeth in warning. The creature that had once been wild and untamed now lay beside him, breathing softly in the warmth of the fire. The bond between them grew stronger, built not on fear, but on trust. The old man, once alone in the world, had found an unlikely companion. And the wolf, once left to die in the snow, had found something even rarer than survival: kindness. But could such a bond truly last? Could a wild beast ever truly trust a man? Or was the call of the wild too strong to resist? The snow-covered forest stretched endlessly, silent and still, as though time itself had frozen in place. In a small wooden cabin on the edge of this wilderness, an old man named Thomas sat by the fire, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the distant howls of wolves, their cries echoing through the trees. Once, he had feared those howls. Now, they were simply a part of the world he had come to accept. Thomas had not always lived in solitude. There was a time when his home had been filled with laughter, the warmth of his wife's embrace, and the playful footsteps of his young son. But fate had a way of unraveling happiness. His wife had been taken by illness, leaving behind only fading memories. His son had left for the city, chasing dreams that had no place in the wilderness. The letters had come for a while, each one bringing a glimpse of a world Thomas could not understand. Then, one day, the letters stopped, and he never heard from his son again. On this bitterly cold night, as the fire flickered in the hearth, a sound reached his ears. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable, a low, pained whimper. His first instinct was to ignore it. The wild had its own laws, and a wounded creature rarely survived the night. But something inside him stirred, a feeling he could not quite place. The sound came again, carrying with it a sense of desperation. Wrapping himself in his thick coat, Thomas took his lantern and stepped outside. The air was sharp against his skin, and the snow crunched beneath his boots. He followed the sound, moving through the trees with the familiarity of a man who had walked these woods for years. The whimper grew louder, guiding him toward the base of an ancient oak. There, half buried in the snow, lay a massive grey wolf. Thomas had seen wolves before, but never this close. This one was larger than any he had encountered, its fur thick and wild, though now matted with blood and ice. Its golden eyes, dulled by pain, flickered toward him. A low growl rumbled in its throat, a final act of defiance despite its weakened state. But then Thomas saw the trap. A steel jaw had clamped down on the wolf's leg, cruel and unforgiving. Blood stained the snow beneath it, a stark contrast against the white. The wolf had struggled, trying to free itself, but the effort had only worsened the wound. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. This was nature's way, survival of the fittest. But as he looked into the wolf's eyes, he saw something he did not expect. Not just pain, not just fear. There was something deeper, a silent plea. Slowly, carefully, Thomas knelt beside the animal. The wolf tensed but did not attack. Maybe it was too weak, or maybe, in some unspoken way, it understood that he was not there to harm it. His hands trembled as he reached for the trap, fingers numb from the cold. With great effort, he pried the steel jaws open. The wolf let out a sharp, strangled cry as its leg was freed, then collapsed, breathing heavily. Thomas removed his coat and wrapped it around the wolf's leg, trying to slow the bleeding. He knew the creature would not survive the night in this condition. Leaving it here meant certain death. The cold would claim it before morning. He did not know what possessed him to do it, but he reached down and, with great effort, lifted the wolf into his arms. Carrying a full-grown wolf was no easy task. Every step was a struggle, his muscles aching under the weight. But he pressed on. The wolf stirred weakly, but it did not resist. Whether from exhaustion or trust, Thomas did not know. After what felt like an eternity, he reached his cabin. Pushing the door open with his shoulder, he staggered inside, the warmth of the fire meeting the icy air in a swirl of mist. He laid the wolf near the hearth, its body motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of its breath. Fetching warm water and clean cloth, he began tending to the wound. It was deep, but not beyond saving. As he cleaned the blood away, he spoke softly, though he was not sure why. The wolf did not bite, did not fight. It simply watched him with those piercing eyes, silent and unblinking. For days, the wolf barely moved. It ate only when Thomas left food near the door, drinking water only when he was across the room. It watched him with cautious eyes, never fully relaxing. Thomas expected it to leave the moment it regained its strength, but it did not. One evening, as Thomas sat by the fire, lost in thought, he felt a presence beside him. He turned and saw the wolf had moved closer. It was no longer in the far corner, no longer keeping its distance. Something had changed. Thomas smiled. "Not so scary now, are you?" The wolf blinked, as if considering his words. Over the following weeks, a strange bond formed between them. The wolf followed Thomas when he gathered firewood, walked beside him along the frozen river, and lay by the fire at night. It was still cautious, still wild, but there was trust now, a fragile, unspoken understanding. The loneliness that had weighed on Thomas for years began to fade. He had spent so long believing he was meant to be alone, yet here was a creature that had every reason to fear him, choosing to stay. But deep down, Thomas knew that the call of the wild could not be silenced forever. The wolf was not meant for walls and warmth. It belonged to the endless forests, to the moonlit nights where its kind roamed free. The day came when the wolf stood at the cabin door, looking out into the vast open wilderness. Its leg had healed, its strength returned. Thomas knew what it meant. He walked over, resting a hand on the doorframe. "Go on," he said softly. "You were never meant to stay." The wolf turned, looking at him one last time. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, without a sound, it stepped into the snow and disappeared into the trees. Thomas stood there for a long time, watching the place where the wolf had vanished. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but full of something unspoken. That night, as he sat by the fire, the familiar howls of the wolves echoed through the mountains. But this time, there was something new in the chorus. A voice he recognized, a farewell, and perhaps a promise. Thomas knew he had to act fast. The cold was unforgiving, and the wolf's wound would only worsen if left untreated. Kneeling beside the beast, he carefully examined the steel jaws clamped around its leg. The trap had cut deep, and every slight movement made the wolf wince in pain. Though weakened, its instinct to fight remained. It let out a guttural growl, its body tense despite its injuries. Thomas did not flinch. He had seen fear before, and he knew that beneath the growl was not aggression, but desperation. He reached out, speaking in a calm, steady voice. "I know it hurts," he murmured, "but I will not hurt you." His hands worked with practiced patience as he pried the rusted steel apart. The trap resisted, the metal stiff from years of exposure to the elements. With a final grunt of effort, Thomas forced it open. The wolf yelped, its body jerking in reflex, but then it collapsed, panting heavily. Thomas removed his coat and carefully wrapped it around the wounded leg, pressing down to slow the bleeding. The warmth of the fabric seemed to calm the wolf. It did not move, did not try to flee. It just breathed, deep, ragged breaths, as if surrendering to the fate that lay before it. A part of Thomas knew the wolf might not survive the night. It had lost too much blood, and the cold could steal whatever strength remained. Leaving it here would be the easiest choice, the safest choice. But something in the old man's heart refused to walk away. With effort, he lifted the wolf into his arms. The weight was almost too much for his weary body, but he gritted his teeth and began the slow, treacherous journey back to his cabin. The snow was thick, each step sinking deeper than the last. The wind howled, biting at his exposed skin, but he pressed on. The wolf's body remained limp, its breathing faint. It was a race against time, and Thomas knew it. At last, the cabin's warm glow came into view. Kicking the door open with his foot, he staggered inside, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He set the wolf down near the fire, unwrapping the coat and grabbing a basin of warm water. He cleaned the wound with care, his fingers numb, yet precise. The wolf remained still, but its golden eyes never left him. Thomas could feel them watching, studying. The wild beast that should have seen him as a threat had chosen to trust him. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. For days, Thomas nursed the wolf back to health. He crushed herbs into a paste, wrapping the injured leg in fresh bandages each morning. He placed bowls of food and water nearby, never forcing the creature to eat, but always making sure it had the option. At first, the wolf did not touch the food. It remained curled near the fire, wary and silent. But one night, Thomas woke to the faint sound of chewing. Progress. Slowly, the wolf began to move again. It would rise, test its weight on the injured leg, then retreat back to rest. It was healing, but it had not yet decided whether to stay or leave. Thomas did not try to control its fate. He simply waited. Then came the moment he had both feared and expected. The wolf, now stronger, stood at the door, staring out at the endless white landscape. The wild was calling. Its home was out there, beyond the walls of the cabin, beyond the warmth of the fire. Thomas stepped forward, his heart heavy, but his voice steady. "Go on," he said softly. "You do not belong here." The wolf hesitated. For a brief moment, it looked back at him, golden eyes locking with his. The old man felt something stir in his chest, an ache he had long forgotten. Then, without a sound, the wolf stepped into the snow, disappearing into the night. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching the place where the wolf had vanished. The silence was deafening. But then, from deep within the forest, a howl rang out. It was strong, powerful, and unmistakably familiar. The old man smiled. He had saved the wolf's life. But in some way, the wolf had saved him too. The night was still, except for the occasional howling of the wind through the trees. Thomas sat near the fire, staring into the flickering flames, his thoughts lost in the past. He had lived in these mountains for years, away from the noise of the world, away from people. His only company had been the silence, the whisper of the trees, and the distant cries of wolves. But tonight, he was not alone. Curled near the fire, its massive body rising and falling with each breath, lay the wounded wolf he had rescued. It had been days since he freed the creature from the steel trap, and though it had been wary at first, something had shifted between them. There was no longer fear in its golden eyes, no more weak growls warning him to stay away. Instead, there was something else, something neither of them could quite explain. The storm outside raged on, heavy snow falling in thick sheets, covering the world in an endless blanket of white. Thomas watched the wolf as it slept, its body twitching slightly as if caught in a dream. He wondered if it dreamed of running again, of the wild, of its pack. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something stir inside him, a warmth he had long forgotten. He had always believed that solitude was his destiny, that he had nothing left to give, nothing left to receive. But this creature, this fierce and wounded beast, had changed something in him. The days passed, and the wolf grew stronger. At first, it barely moved, lying near the fire as Thomas tended to its wounds. But soon, it began to test its strength, standing on shaky legs, taking careful steps around the cabin. Thomas watched it with quiet admiration. It was a fighter, just like him. He spoke to it often, even though he knew it did not understand. "You remind me of someone," he would say, his voice low and gentle. "A younger version of me, full of scars, but still standing." The wolf would tilt its head slightly as if listening. It was a strange companionship, one neither of them had sought but had somehow found. The wolf no longer flinched when Thomas moved near, no longer bared its fangs in warning. It allowed him to dress its wounds, to place food nearby without hesitation. It was still wild, still untamed, but there was trust now, fragile, unspoken, but real. One evening, Thomas stepped outside to gather more firewood. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. He had grown used to the quiet, used to the solitude. But as he turned back toward the cabin, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The wolf was standing in the doorway, watching him. It was the first time it had crossed the threshold on its own, the first time it had chosen to step outside since that fateful night. Thomas held his breath, afraid that if he moved too suddenly, the moment would shatter. The wolf took another step forward. Thomas set the firewood down, his heart beating a little faster. Slowly, he extended his hand, palm open, offering nothing but his presence. The wolf hesitated. And then, to his astonishment, it closed the distance between them and pressed its nose against his palm. A bond was sealed. From that day on, the wolf followed him. It walked beside him when he went to the river, stood watch when he chopped wood, and sat near him as he drank his tea by the fire. It never acted like a pet, never demanded affection, but its presence alone was enough. Thomas did not know how long this would last. The wolf belonged to the wild, and eventually it would leave. That was the way of nature. But for now, they had each other. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late, the fire in the hearth burning low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Thomas had just drifted off to sleep when a low growl rumbled through the room. His eyes snapped open. The wolf was standing near the door, its body rigid, ears pricked forward. Thomas sat up. "What is it?" Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft padding of an animal in the snow. Human footsteps. A deep, unsettling dread settled in his chest. No one came this far into the wilderness, not unless they had a reason. The wolf let out another low growl, its body tense, ready to fight. Thomas reached for the old rifle he kept by his bed, his hands steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. Then, a knock. It was not polite. It was firm, insistent. Thomas rose to his feet, motioning for the wolf to stay back. He unlatched the door and opened it slightly, just enough to see who stood outside. A man, dressed in heavy furs, his face partially hidden beneath a hood. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "Evening," the stranger said, his voice rough. "Did not expect to find anyone out here." Thomas did not answer. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best defense. The stranger shifted slightly. "I was tracking a wolf," he continued, eyes flicking past Thomas and into the cabin. "Wounded one. Caught it in a trap a few miles back. You have not seen it, have you?" Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Behind him, the wolf let out a low, menacing growl. The man's eyes narrowed. "Ah," he said slowly. "I see." Thomas gripped the rifle tighter. "It is mine now," he said, his voice steady. The stranger smirked. "Yours?" He shook his head. "That is a wild animal, old man. It is worth a good price to the right buyer. I suggest you step aside." Thomas did not move. "Leave." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Then, without another word, the stranger turned and walked back into the night. Thomas waited until the footsteps faded completely before closing the door and bolting it shut. He turned back to the wolf, who was still watching the door, its body tense. "It is all right," Thomas murmured. "He is gone." The wolf relaxed slightly, but its eyes remained alert, ears flicking at every distant sound. That night, Thomas did not sleep. He kept the rifle close, listening to the wind, to the fire, to the steady breathing of the creature that now trusted him more than its own kind. Morning came, painting the world in pale blues and silvers. Thomas stepped outside, scanning the horizon. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign of the man, but he knew better than to believe he would not return. The wolf joined him, standing beside him as they looked out at the endless white. Thomas exhaled slowly. "We will be ready," he said. And for the first time in years, he truly believed it. The days stretched into weeks, and though the stranger never returned, Thomas remained vigilant. The wolf never left his side, its presence a silent promise. Eventually, as the snow melted and the seasons changed, Thomas knew the time was near. The wolf had healed. Its leg was strong again, its body no longer weary from injury. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the wild. Thomas understood. He walked over, his steps slow, his chest heavy. "It is time, huh?" The wolf turned, looking at him one last time. Then, with a quiet grace, it padded forward and pressed its head against his hand. Thomas swallowed hard. "Go on then," he whispered. The wolf turned and ran, its powerful form disappearing into the trees. Thomas stood there for a long time, watching the place where it had vanished. The loneliness settled in once more. But it was different now. Lighter. Then, just as he turned to head back inside, a howl echoed through the forest. Strong, familiar, a farewell, and a promise. Thomas smiled. He was alone again. But he was no longer lonely. Thomas never imagined himself as anything more than a solitary man, someone who had chosen to live outside the boundaries of society. He had spent years believing that he needed no one, that the silence of the wilderness was enough to sustain him. But now, with every step he took, a presence followed, a shadow that was no longer just his own. At first, the wolf's decision to stay confused him. It was a creature of instinct, meant for the wild, meant to roam free. Yet, it lingered. Even after the wounds had healed and its strength had returned, it remained by his side. Thomas would wake in the mornings to find the wolf curled near the dying embers of the fire. When he chopped wood, the wolf watched from a distance, its golden eyes tracking his every move. When he went to the river, it padded beside him, silent as a ghost. It never begged for food, never demanded attention. It was simply there. The bond between them was not one of ownership, nor was it the forced companionship of man and pet. It was something else, something deeper, an understanding, a choice. Thomas often caught himself talking to the wolf, even though he knew it did not understand. "You are still here," he would say, shaking his head. "I figured you would be gone by now." The wolf would tilt its head, as if considering his words. One evening, as the sky turned to shades of orange and pink, Thomas sat outside, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wolf sat beside him, its massive form still as stone. "You are not meant for this life," Thomas murmured. "You have a pack out there, a family." The wolf said nothing, of course, but as the wind swept through the trees, it did something that caught Thomas off guard. It nudged its nose against his hand. A simple touch, brief, but deliberate. Thomas swallowed hard. He had spent so many years pushing people away, choosing solitude over connection. He had told himself that loneliness was safer, that it was better to live without attachments. But now, with this wolf at his side, he realized something he had long denied. He had never wanted to be alone. Days passed, and their routines became one. Thomas no longer questioned why the wolf stayed, nor did he wonder when it might leave. He simply accepted its presence as part of his life. He found himself leaving scraps of meat near the fire without a second thought. He would glance over his shoulder, expecting to see those golden eyes watching him. The loneliness he had carried for so long began to fade, replaced by something warmer, something unfamiliar. One night, as the fire crackled and the stars shimmered above, Thomas reached out, hesitantly, cautiously. His hand hovered for a moment before settling on the thick fur of the wolf's back. It did not flinch. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the comfort of another being, a presence that did not demand anything from him except trust. And in that moment, he understood. They had both been wounded, and somehow, together, they had begun to heal. The world had its opinions. People always did. They saw the wild as something to be feared, something untamable, something that belonged far away from human hands. "A wolf is not a dog," they would say. "It does not know loyalty. It does not understand kindness. It only knows hunger, and when the time comes, it will do what it must to survive." Thomas had heard these words before, spoken by hunters, whispered by old men in trading posts on the edge of civilization. They would laugh at the idea of a man and a wolf sharing more than just a brief, fragile moment. You have given it food, warmth, safety, they would say. But the moment it is hungry, the moment it senses weakness, it will not remember your kindness. And maybe they were right. Maybe in another life, in another time, the wolf would have been nothing more than a predator, and he nothing more than prey. But Thomas had lived long enough to know that not everything in life followed the rules of men. Trust was not something that could be forced. It was not something that could be bought with food or stolen with trickery. It was a choice. And the wolf? It had chosen him. There were times when he questioned it himself, when doubt crept in like a shadow beneath the door. There were moments when the wolf would stare into the night, its golden eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, and Thomas would wonder, was there a hunger there? Was there a longing for something more than what he could provide? But every morning, when he awoke, the wolf was still there. One winter night, when the wind howled through the trees and the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, Thomas sat by the fire, his fingers tracing the worn edges of a wooden cup. The wolf lay beside him, its massive body stretched out on the wooden floor, breathing slow and steady. "You are free, you know," Thomas murmured, staring into the fire. "Nothing is keeping you here." The wolf's ears twitched, but it did not move. Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe I am a fool," he admitted. "Maybe I should have let you go when you healed. Maybe I should not have trusted you." The wolf opened one eye, glancing at him as if it had heard every word. Thomas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "And yet, here you are." There was no leash between them, no collar, no chains. The wolf had every opportunity to leave, and yet it stayed. The arguments of men, the warnings of hunters, the whispered fears of strangers, they all meant nothing in the face of this simple truth. One evening, as the last of the snow melted and the air carried the promise of spring, Thomas found himself at the edge of the clearing, watching the tree line. The wolf stood beside him, its posture calm but alert. Somewhere in the distance, a howl echoed through the valley. A call, a beckoning. The wolf's ears pricked forward, its body tensed ever so slightly. Thomas felt his heart tighten. This was the moment, was it not? The moment everyone had warned him about. The moment the wild would reclaim what was always meant to be free. He took a breath. "You can go," he said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "I will not stop you." The wolf turned its head slightly, looking at him with those golden eyes. Another howl rang out, closer this time. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the wolf did something Thomas had never expected. It sat down. Thomas let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You stubborn thing. The world might never understand. People would still argue, still whisper that wolves and men were never meant to walk the same path." But Thomas no longer cared. Some bonds defied logic. Some trusts could not be explained. And in the end, what mattered was not what others believed. What mattered was what the wolf had chosen. And it had chosen to stay. Years passed, and the bond between Thomas and the wolf became legend. The seasons changed, painting the forest in hues of gold, white, and green. Yet the two remained together. A man who had once sought solitude, and a beast who had once known only the law of survival. The villagers who lived miles away often whispered about the strange friendship. Some believed it was a miracle. Others called it foolishness. But none could deny that something unexplainable had happened in that lonely cabin deep in the wilderness. As time wore on, Thomas grew slower. His hands, once strong enough to chop wood in a single swing, trembled with age. His legs, which had carried him through the thickest snow, now struggled with the simplest of steps. And yet, through it all, the wolf remained by his side. On the coldest nights, when the fire struggled to keep the cabin warm, the wolf curled against him, its thick fur shielding him from the bitter chill. When Thomas woke in the early hours of the morning, his stiff limbs aching, he would find those golden eyes watching over him. "You have given me more than I ever thought I would have," Thomas whispered one night, his voice raspy with age. "You have given me a friend." The wolf blinked slowly, resting its head on its paws, as if understanding. One winter morning, the villagers who occasionally checked on Thomas made their way through the forest, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. They had not seen him in weeks, and concern weighed heavy in their hearts. When they arrived at the cabin, they found him sitting on the porch, wrapped in his old, tattered coat. His hands rested on his lap, his face tilted toward the sky. His eyes were closed, but there was a peaceful smile on his lips. Thomas had passed away in his sleep, embraced by the stillness of the forest he had called home for so many years. But he was not alone. Beside him, the great wolf sat, unmoving. It did not run when the villagers approached. It did not bare its fangs or flee into the woods. Instead, it remained at his side, standing guard over the man who had once saved its life. And then, as the wind stirred the trees, the wolf lifted its head and let out a howl, a sound so mournful, so filled with grief, that it sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. A wild beast or a loyal friend? You decide. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in the power of kindness. And remember, sometimes the ones we fear the most are the ones who need us the most. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the beauty in unexpected friendships.